Hey, creative souls, thanks for tuning in. I'm really happy that you're here. My name's Johnny. I'm a published fiction writer and a retired adjunct writing professor. For 2 decades, I helped reluctant college students get their words on the page. Now, I help people write novels, and I teach fiction writing and screenwriting to adults in custody. I call myself a word witch, and if you want to know more about what I mean by that, check out my video called On Being a Word Witch. I believe I'm on this earth to heal the world through stories, whether it's the ones that I write and tell or the ones that I help you write and tell. I'm new here on YouTube, and I fully embrace the notion of energetic reciprocity. So if anything I say helps, resonates, inspires you in some way, I would really appreciate your likes, shares, and subscribes. Because obviously, if I can grow my channel, I can do more in my quest to heal the world through stories. Because as I always say, stories can heal the world. So let's do it together. So today I want to talk to you about the epistolary novel. Before I get to that, I want to check in and see how you're doing with your reading planning for the year. And if you haven't gotten my free reading planner for 2024, hop on it quick because it's going to go away in a week or two when I start promoting my new membership group called Alchemy of Writing, which I also hope you'll opt into. So I'll have more details about that in an upcoming video. But for now, if you want the reading planner, go to my website, johnnymazzacco.com, and you'll see right there at the top of the page, you can download it. It's a downloadable, fillable PDF where you can plot out your reading goals by the week. There's a place for title, author, and then also a field for purpose so that you can keep track of why you're reading, whether it's for pleasure, research, self-improvement, whatever. And then each month also has a section called Notes and Takeaways where you can make notes to yourself if you need to refer back to something later on in the year. Okay? So that's it. You can get it at johnnymazzacco.com. Hope you'll get it before it goes away. All right? So, on to the topic at hand, the epistolary novel. So this type of novel is one of the first forms of the novel that existed. And what I like about it is I've been giving this some thought, and what I've run into is that when I talk to people about writing a novel, just the whole proposition of it just feels so daunting to people. And I started thinking, I wonder if the epistolary approach might feel more doable to people because the pieces of it are more obvious. So the idea of starting a letter and finishing a letter feels way more doable than starting and finishing an entire novel. And so I think for some people, psychologically, it might be more comforting, more appealing, and you might get further in the process if you start working on one. And so, of course, we want to still have that kind of overarching story arc and character arcs, but I think just getting started with a letter and then another letter can really feel like we can check things off the list and that we're actually making progress. So this is why I wanted to talk about it today. When we're able to really conceptualize these definable chunks that are needed to tell a story, I think something different happens in our brain and we don't feel so defeated before we even get started. And so these definable chunks are, as I said, letters. They can also be emails. They can be documents of any kind, news clippings. They can be text messages. They can be tweets. It can be a number of things, just any kind of communication. And I'll talk in just a minute about the different ways this can show up in an epistolary novel. I was also thinking it might be interesting to perhaps incorporate podcasts and to get creative about how might we portray that on the page. Another thought that I had was, what if in an epistolary novel we were to incorporate videos? How would that happen? Is there a way to do that on the page? I don't know. I haven't tried it. But a thought that I had was, what if we created a digital epistolary novel and we could embed videos in it? All right. So I think we can get very creative with this kind of novel. And to me, that's very exciting. One thing I like about this, or one thing I guess we ought to note, is that the epistolary novel really relies on a very subjective point of view. All right. And I'll talk more about what I mean by that in just a minute. And I mentioned in a recent video about a novel called The Moon Sisters by Teresa Walsh, how she signed alternating chapters to these two sisters that the story is about. And so we get different points of view in that way. And as I recall, they are written in first person. I could be wrong about that. But nonetheless, in that novel, there are alternating chapters from the point of view of two different sisters. And so that's kind of how the epistolary novel works. So there are three ways we can tell a novel of this nature. So the first is the monologic. So what that means, as the term indicates, there is one voice. And so that is one person writing letters to someone, to a system, to something else, to another entity. And that's how the story unfolds, right? And so a great example of this is Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. So if you want to see what a monologic epistolary novel looks like, check that out. Next, we have the dialogic epistolary novel. An example of that is Dostoevsky's novel called Poor Folk. So you can check that out. And as the name indicates, that's two people communicating back and forth. The third type is the polylogic epistolary novel. And as the name indicates, multiple voices, multiple points of view. And I'm going to have to look down and read the title of this one because it's very long and I want to get it right. So the name of the novel is The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society. And I will admit, I've seen the movie, I've not read the novel. But this story, there are multiple points of view in this, and it's done in an epistolary fashion. And it is written by Marianne Schaefer and Annie Barrows. So check that one out if you've not, so you can see that type of epistolary novel in action. All right, so the pros of writing an epistolary novel are that we get that kind of intimacy that some people love when they read first person. So get this very intimate look at the story from the point of view of one person. So we can really feel like we're getting into their skin, right? I think for people who keep a journal or a diary, this might be a really nice segue into writing a novel. Because I mentioned in a past video, in a couple, I guess, that I don't think that just because someone keeps a journal means that they are a writer, but I think that can be a great precursor to moving on to writing a novel in an epistolary format. Some people might say that a disadvantage of a monologic epistolary novel is that we only get one view and one view only, and so we don't get the bigger picture. But that's true even of a novel that's written in first person, right? So it's just a choice that we make as the writer. And it may take getting into it a bit to see if that's the right choice for the story we want to tell, or if we need to incorporate other voices. And other voices even can be, like I mentioned earlier, newspaper clippings. It could mean legal documents. Those can be construed as other voices that could enter into the story and give other points of view about what's happening. I had a client for a while who was working on a novel about a female detective, and she was going to use the epistolary approach in part, not fully, but she was going to incorporate journal entries of this detective and what she found on this case that she was working on, as well as old newspaper clippings to kind of round out the story and give some backstory. All right, so that's an example. You might even see some epistolary novels that look a little scrapbooky because they have images of like torn newspaper clippings and that kind of thing. And so there's also this particular kind of aesthetic around this kind of novel that's really appealing to a lot of people. So here's some traits of the epistolary novel. As I mentioned before, this very subjective point of view. So even if you have multiple points of view, they're all going to be very subjective from their point. And I use this analogy when I teach oftentimes. I especially used it when I taught argumentation, but it also applies to writing fiction. If you imagine a park, and on the four corners of the park, I ask 4 different people to go out and view a corner. One might see a beautiful fountain. One might see a bunch of kids playing and having fun. Down here, someone might see a pile of trash. And in this corner, someone might see this horrible fight break out. So each of those people is going to have a very subjective view about what that park is about. Some may love it. The 2 that saw these 2 views up here, these 2 down here may not like it at all. They may think it's a horrible place to be. And so this is how it works in life. Our own limited views of the world can really define and even restrict how we see life and people and the world in general. When those 4 people come back to me and report what they saw, I will be the one with the best view of that park. And I wasn't even there, right? So think about that in terms of point of view and how the epistolary novel is very subjective. That's not a bad thing. It's just the way it is, and it's something to keep in mind. There's oftentimes also far less dialogue in an epistolary novel. And that doesn't mean there's no dialogue. There could be, depending on how it shows up and why it shows up. But generally, we think of an epistolary novel as being more reflective, kind of introspective, and it's more about thoughts and feelings and memories even sometimes. And so there's usually, I would say, this feeling of more telling than showing in an epistolary novel. Because usually we hear the adage, show don't tell, right? So there's a bit of a different tone in an epistolary novel where people are kind of ruminating and, think about the sound of someone reading a letter, having a narrator like in a film. There's a different vibe to that, a different tone than when we see an actual scene playing out, right? So that's kind of how an epistolary novel feels and works. All right, so how do you write an epistolary novel then? Well, the first thing is to get really comfortable writing in first person. So if that's not something you've done, I would say start practicing with that. And if you have a character envisioned, start writing from that character's point of view. And if you're not sure how to do that, there's a video you can see up above. There's a video that I did a while back about how to use my method that I've created called Writing Through the Body, and it has 7 levels of character discovery. And so I did a kind of a boiled down version of that you can see in that video. If that will help you build a character, discover a character, and then start practicing writing in first person from their point of view. So really think about who all your characters are, who needs to be in this story to really fully tell it, and specifically who is your protagonist. And it's helpful to get really clear on what their deepest desire is. What is it they really want deep down in their heart and soul? Maybe it's something that they don't even want to admit to anyone. Maybe they haven't even admitted it to themselves. And maybe that's part of telling this story is so that they can have the realization about what it is they really want. But you as the writer, you always need to know. And then, what is their deepest wound? Because that's going to directly impact their deepest desire. And it may be the reason their deepest desire exists. And then what do you anticipate their greatest obstacles being in their quest to get this desire that they have? Or what was it? What was the desire? If the epistolary novel you end up writing has to do with a reflection of the past and you want to show the unfolding, what was that desire? And how did it work out? Did they get the desire? Did they realize, oh, that's not really what I wanted after all? Did they always know what they wanted, never got it, and then came to terms with it? All of these things are possibilities, right, in a storyline. Another thing to get really clear about is who is the protagonist, the primary point of view. If you're writing a monologic epistolary novel, who is that person writing to? If it's 2 people, why are they writing to each other? And if it's multiple voices telling the story, why are they writing and how do they show up? Are they writing directly to each other or in some other way? Are they, for instance, one's writing a blog and that's his or her voice. Another is writing a letter to a long-lost love. How would those 2 interconnect and cross over to help create the story? And then obviously, how many perspectives do you want in your story? How many are needed? And I think the really cool thing about an epistolary novel, especially if you use multiple points of view, is you can get really good practice at writing from the first person point of view from a variety of different perspectives. And so it really calls us to kind of become actors of sorts, even if just in our minds, right? And tell a story, the same story from different points of view so that the reader can have the full picture, if that's what's necessary. And so one suggestion is to not explain what you're doing, just do it. So just start by writing a letter, start with an email, throw in text messages if that's what you want to use. Just put it on the page and do it and let the reader understand that this is the format that's happening. So with an epistolary novel, generally there is no setup. It just, boom, you start right in and the form starts on the first page. And granted, there may be exceptions to that, but at least when you first get started, just start writing a letter that a person in your story would write to another person and go from there. So you want to be able to also discern what the plot is, right? And so it's very helpful. I mentioned that 7-level character discovery method of mine called Writing Through the Body. If you use that, the plot will just start to unfold. Once you understand your protagonist and their deepest desire and their wound, the plot will start to present itself, and you can go from there. And then I would say the next step is determine a timeline. How much time, what span of time does this story take place in? Is it over decades? Is it a year? Is it a month? I think deciding that up front will really help you frame it and contain it in a way so it doesn't start to feel out of control. So how to start? Like I mentioned, start with the character. Get to know who they are, really discover them deep down. Get to know supporting characters, get to know your antagonist or antagonists if there are more than one, and then really hone in on that desire and wound and the obstacles. Oftentimes, the obstacle and the wound are the same thing. So if it's a story where there's this inner struggle, then that's where you want to go. That wound, that desire, that will show you how the obstacle might start to play into the story. In the comments, I will put a few, I think there might be like 10 to 15 titles of epistolary novels that you might want to look at. And then I'll put a link to my blog, which I created this list, this extensive list of 180 titles in chronological order that you can check out and take a look at. And each of those titles on the blog links to Amazon. Not that I'm supporting Amazon, because if you're like me, you prefer supporting local bookstores. But linking to Amazon was a way to easily find the titles and send you to a place where you can read a synopsis and see if that's a book that you might want to explore further. And once you know, then you can buy it wherever you want. And having said that, this is also not a critique or judgment against people who use Amazon. I use Amazon for some things. I also think it's a behemoth, and so it's a struggle, right? So all that said, those are there on the blog. Please go check them out and really start exploring the epistolary novel. If you want to write a novel and haven't started yet because it just feels way too big, I think this is a great way to start. All right, so that's all I have today for the epistolary novel. There's, I'm sure, so much more to say. And if you know of any other titles that I haven't added to my list on the blog, please drop them in the comments here or over on the blog, and I'll just keep building that list out because I think these are really helpful examples to have to help guide you on your way if you want to write this type of novel. Okay, so thank you so much for watching and listening and liking and sharing and subscribing. And again, don't forget that reading planner if you want to plan your reading for the rest of the year on my website, johnnymazzacco.com, coming down in a week or two because I'll be promoting my new membership group, Alchemy of Writing, which I hope you'll take part in. Okay? Thank you so much. As always, sending you mad writing mojo. Happy writing.